Good afternoon, dear friends. Today is the 23rd of June, and I'm glad to see you. And now, the fairy tale, The Ebony Horse. Once upon a time, there was a great and powerful king of Persia named Sabur, whose wealth and wisdom surpassed all other monarchs in his day and age. Moreover, he was generous, kind, and beneficent. He comforted those whose spirits were broken, and he treated those who fled to him for refuge with honor. He loved the poor and was hospitable to strangers, and he always sought to defend the oppressed against their oppressors. King Saba had 3 daughters as beautiful as flower gardens in full bloom, and a son as handsome as the moon. And it was his custom to celebrate 2 holidays during the year: the Nowruz or New Year, and Mahgan or the autumnal equinox. On both occasions he threw open his palace, gave alms to the people, made proclamations of safety and security, and promoted his chamberlains and viceroys. The people of his realm came to him, saluted him, and celebrated these holidays with joy. And they also brought him gifts, servants, and eunuchs. Now King Saba loved science and geometry, and on one holiday, as he sat on his throne, 3 wise men entered his palace and approached him. They were cunning inventors and masters of all sorts of craft. Indeed, they could make things so unusual and rare that it was impossible to discern how they were invented. These men were versed in the knowledge of the occult and knew all about the mysteries of the world. Each one was from a different country and spoke a foreign language. The first was a Hindi or Indian, the second of Rumi or Greek, and the third a Farsi or Persian. When the Indian stepped forward, he prostrated himself before the king, wished him a joyous holiday, and placed before him a gift befitting his dignity. It was a man of gold, set with precious gems and jewels, and holding a golden trumpet in his hand. When Saba saw this, he said, "Tell me, sage, what can this figure do?" And the Indian answered, "My lord, if this figure is placed at the gate of your city, he will be a most powerful protector, for whenever an enemy tries to enter, the figure will blow this trumpet against him, and he will be seized with palsy and drop down dead. The king was extremely astonished by this gift and declared, "By Allah, if you are telling the truth, I'll grant you anything you wish or desire." Then the Greek stepped forward, and after prostrating himself before the king, he gave him a silver basin with a golden peacock and 24 golden chicks in the middle of it. Saba looked at the basin and then inquired, "Tell me, sage, what can this peacock do?" "My lord," he answered, "whenever an hour of the day or night elapses, it pecks one of its young, cries out, and flaps its wings every hour on the hour. Then when the end of the mouth arrives, it will open its mouth, and you will see the crescent inside it." And the king said, "If you are telling the truth, I'll grant anything you wish or desire." Then the Persian sage stepped forward, and after prostrating himself before the king, he presented him with a horse made of the darkest ebony wood, with a gold and jeweled inlay, and with saddle, stirrups, and bridle suitable for majesty of the king. When Saba saw the horse, he was extremely astounded and admired the beauty of its form and style. So he asked, "What can this wooden horse do? Tell me its virtue and whether it can move." "My lord," the Persian answered, "if one mounts this horse, it will carry him wherever he wants. It can ride through the air and cover the space of a year in a single day." The king was amazed by these wonders, especially since they came all on the same day, and he turned to the Persian sage and said, "By Allah, if you are telling the truth, I'll certainly grant you whatever you desire." Then he entertained the sages for 3 days, so they could try out the gifts. During that time, each one demonstrated what his invention could do. The man of gold blew his trumpet, the peacock pecked its cheeks, and the Persian sage mounted the ebony horse, which soared with him high in the air and descended again. When King Saba saw all this, he was amazed and overcome with joy. Then he said to the 3 sages, "I am now convinced of the truth of your words, and it behooves me to keep my promise. So you may now ask for whatever you want, and I shall grant your wishes." Well, news about the beauty of the king's 3 daughters had reached these sages, and thus they asked, "If the king is content with us and our gifts and allows us to make a request, we beg that he give us his 3 daughters in marriage, so that we may become his sons-in-law." "Your wish is granted," the king said, and ordered the Qazi to come right away so that he could marry his daughters to these sages. Now it so happened that the princesses were behind a curtain and witnessed this entire scene. The youngest saw that her husband-to-be was at least 100 years old. He had white hair, a drooping forehead, mangy eyebrows, cropped ears, a dyed mustache and bird-red eyes, bleached and hollow cheeks, a flabby nose, overlapping teeth, loose lips like camel's kidneys, and a face like a cobbler's apron. In short, he was a terror, a horror, a monster. Indeed, he was the most frightful sight of his time. In contrast, the girl was the fairest and most graceful of her time, more elegant than the finest gazelle, more tender than the gentlest breeze, and certainly more beautiful than the brightest full moon. She was made for love and walked with a graceful sway that captivated all those who saw her. In short, she was more beautiful and sweeter than her two sisters, who were splendid specimens themselves. So when she saw her suitor, she went to her room and strewed dust on her head, tore her clothes, slapped her face, and wept. Now her brother, Prince Akmar, had just returned from a journey, and when he heard her weeping like that, he entered her chamber, for he loved her with more affection than his other sisters, and said, "What's wrong with you? What's happened to you? Tell me everything and don't hide a thing." "My brother," she responded, "I have nothing to hide. Our father has decided to do something atrocious, and I intend to leave the palace, and I'll do this even if he doesn't consent, for the Lord will provide for me." "What's the meaning of this talk?" her brother responded. "What's caused all this trouble and disturbed your heart?" And the princess answered, "Our father has promised me in marriage to a wicked magician who has brought him a horse of black wood as a gift. This magician has bewitched our father with his craft and sorcery, but as for me, I don't want to have anything to do with him, and I wish I had never been born because of him." After her brother comforted her, he went to his father and said, "Who is this wizard that you are going to wed to my youngest sister? What's so wonderful about his present that you don't care if your daughter is deeply distressed? Do you think what you are doing is right?" Now the Persian was standing nearby and heard the prince's words, which filled him with rage. Meanwhile the king replied, "My son, if you saw this horse, you'd be amazed." Then he ordered the slaves to bring the horse before him, and they did as he commanded. When the prince saw the horse, he was pleased, and being an accomplished cavalier, he mounted it right away and struck its sides with the stirrups. However, it did not move, and the king said to the sage, "Go and show him how it moves, so that he may help you obtain your wish." Of course, the Persian was still holding a grudge against the prince, because the young man was opposed to his marriage with the princess. So he showed him the button on the right side of the horse that would make the horse take off and said, "Push this," and went away. Thereupon the prince pushed the button, and the horse soared with him high in the air as if it were a bird, and it kept on flying until it disappeared from everyone's sight. The king was extremely upset by this and said to the Persian, "See to it that you get him to descend." "O Lord," the Persian responded, "there's nothing I can do. You won't see him again until resurrection day." For he was too ignorant and too proud to ask me about the button for descending, and I forgot to tell him where it is. When the king heard this, he became extremely angry and had the sage whipped and thrown in jail, while he himself discarded his crown, slapped his face, and pounded his breast. Moreover, he closed the door of his palace, and he was joined by his wife, his daughters, and the rest of the people of the city in weeping and mourning for the prince. Thus their joy was turned into sorrow, and their happiness into sadness. In the meantime, the horse kept soaring with the prince until it drew near the sun. As a result, the prince gave himself up for lost and repented for having mounted the horse. "Truly," he said, "the sage tricked me because of my youngest sister. By Allah, it seems I'm lost, but there must be a button for landing if there is one for taking off." Now he was a smart and clever man, so he began to feel all the parts of the horse, but he saw nothing except buttons like cocks' heads on the right and left shoulders of the horse. "That's all there is, it seems," he said to himself. "Just these two buttons." Then he pushed the one on the right, and the horse increased its speed and flew higher. So he stopped and pushed the button on the left, and immediately the horse's upward motion slowed until it began to descend little by little toward the face of the earth. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching, and she stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "When the prince saw what was happening and realized that he had learned to control the horse, he was filled with joy and thanked Almighty Allah, who had delivered him from certain death. Then he began to turn the horse's head wherever he wanted to go, and he made it soar and descend at his will until he attained complete mastery over it. Finally, he made it descend, and this descent took the entire day, because the horse had carried him far from the earth. As he descended, he amused himself by viewing the different cities and countries that he had never seen before. Among them was a very beautiful city amidst a verdant countryside, rich in trees and streams, with gazelles gliding over the plains. Upon seeing this city, he began musing to himself, I wish I knew the name of that city and in what country it was. And he began to circle and observe it. By this time, the day had begun to decline, and it was near sunset. So he said to himself, "Certainly, there's no better place to spend the night than in this fine city. I might as well stay here, and early tomorrow morning I'll return to my kith and kin and my kingdom. Then I'll tell my father and my family what happened and what I've seen." Now he began looking for a place where he might safely land, and where no one might catch sight of him. Soon he glimpsed a tall palace in the middle of the city. It was surrounded by a large wall with lofty towers and battlements, and was guarded by 40 black slaves clad in complete mail and armed with spears and swords and bows and arrows. "That's a good spot," he said, and he pushed the descent button, which made the horse fly down like a weary bird, and he landed gently on the terrace roof of the palace. After the prince dismounted and gave his praise to Allah, he inspected the horse and said, "Whoever invented and built you so perfectly was a clever craftsman, and if the Almighty grants me a long life and reunites me with my father and family safe and sound, I'll certainly bestow on him all kinds of gifts and treat him with the utmost generosity." But this time night had come, and he sat on the roof until he was certain that everyone in the palace was asleep. Indeed, he was extremely hungry and thirsty, for he had not eaten or drunk anything since he had been separated from his father. So he said to himself, "I'm sure that there's plenty to eat and drink in this palace." So he left the horse above and went down into the palace in search of something to eat. Soon he came to a staircase, and after he went down to the bottom, he found himself in a court paved with white marble and alabaster, which shone in the light of the moon. He was astounded by the place and the fine architecture, but there was not a single sign of a living soul, and he was surprised and perplexed. After he looked to the right and the left, he could not decide which way to go, and said to himself, "Perhaps it would be better if I returned to where I left my horse and spent the night by its side. Then as soon as day dawns, I'll mount it and ride away." And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching, and she stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale, and said, "As he was talking to himself, he spotted a light inside the palace, and after heading in that direction, he found that it came from a candle that stood in front of a door to the harem. Next to the candle was a huge eunuch who was asleep. He looked like one of the Ifrits of Solomon, or a tribesman of the Jinn, as long and as broad as a tree. As he lay on the floor, the pommel of his sword gleamed in the flame of the candle, and at his head was a bag of leather hanging from a granite column. When the prince saw the eunuch, he was frightened and said, "May Allah help me, O Holy One, just as you saved me in the sky. Please let me escape safe and sound from this adventure." After saying this, he reached for the leather bag, and after grabbing hold of it, he carried it to the side, opened it, and found some very good food. Thereupon he ate his fill and refreshed himself. Afterward, he returned the bag to its place and drew the eunuch's sword from its sheath while the slave kept sleeping. Then the prince continued exploring the harem until he came to a second door with a curtain drawn before it. So he lifted the curtain, and upon entering the room, he saw a couch of whitest ivory lined with pearls, jacinths, and jewels, and 4 slave girls sleeping around it. He went up to the couch to see what was on it, and found a young lady lying asleep. She looked like the full moon rising over the eastern horizon, with her brow decorated by white flowers, her hair shining, her cheeks crimson and dotted by dainty moles. Indeed, he was amazed by her stunning beauty as she lay there, and he no longer was afraid of dying. So he went up to her, and trembling in every nerve and shuddering with pleasure, he kissed her on the right cheek, whereupon she awoke right away and opened her eyes. Seeing the prince standing before her, she said, "Who are you, and where have you come from?" "I'm your slave and lover," he said. "And who brought you here?" she asked. "My lord and my destiny," he replied. Then said Shams al-Nahar, for that was her name, "Perhaps you are the one who asked my father yesterday for my hand in marriage, and was rejected by him because he thought you were atrocious. By Allah, if that's the cause, my sire lied through his teeth when he said this, for you are quite handsome." Now the son of the king of Hind had wanted to marry her, and her father had rejected him, because he was indeed ugly and uncouth, and the princess thought the prince was the rejected suitor. So when she saw how handsome and elegant he was, for he was clearly more radiant than the moon, she was ignited by the flaming fire of love, and they began to converse and talk. Suddenly her waiting women awoke, and upon seeing the prince with their mistress, they said to her, "My lady, who is this man?" "I don't know," she said. "I found him sitting by me when I woke up. Perhaps he is the prince who sought my hand in marriage from my father." "By Allah," they cried out, "this man is not the one who sought your hand in marriage, for the other was hideous, and this one is handsome. Indeed, the other man is not even fit to be his servant." Then the slave girls ran out to the eunuch and after they waked him from his slumber, he jumped up in alarm. "How is it that you are supposed to be on guard in the palace," they said, "and yet men come into our chamber when we are asleep?" When the black heard this, he quickly grabbed for his sword, but could not find it, and he was seized by fear. Totally confused by what was happening, he rushed to his mistress, and upon seeing the prince sitting and talking to her, he said, "My lord, are you a man or a genie?" "Woe to you, you unluckiest of slaves," the prince replied. "How dare you compare a son of royal courtiers with one of those pagan devils?" And he became like a raging lion, took the eunuch's sword in his hand, and said, "I am the king's son-in-law, and he is married me to his daughter, and commanded me to go and see her." When the eunuch heard these words, he replied, "My lord, if you are indeed the man you say you are, she is only fit for you, and you are worthier of her than anyone else." Thereupon the eunuch ran to the king, shrieking aloud, tearing his garments, and tossing dust on his head. When the king heard this outcry, he said, "What's happened to you? Speak quickly and be brief, for you've sent chills up my spine." "O king," answered the eunuch, "go and rescue your daughter, for a devil of the jinn who's taken on the guise of a king's son has got possession of her. Get up at once." When the king heard this, he would have liked to kill the eunuch for being so careless and letting a demon get hold of his daughter. Instead, he stood up and rushed to his daughter's chamber, where he found her slave women awaiting him. "What's happened to my daughter?" he asked. "Your Majesty," they answered, "slumber overcame us, and when we awoke, we found a young man sitting on her couch in conversation with her. He looks like the full moon, and we've never seen a man as handsome as he is. So we asked him to explain everything, and he told us that you had given him your daughter in marriage. That's all we know. Nor are we sure whether he is a man or genie. Whether he is certainly modest and well-bred, and has done nothing disgraceful." Now when the king heard these words, his wrath cooled, and he raised the curtain little by little, and as he looked in, he saw his daughter talking with a handsome prince whose face glistened like the moon. Yet he felt he must protect his daughter's honor, and could not control his feelings. So he brushed the curtain aside, rushed in, and drew his sword like a furious gull. When the prince saw him, he asked the princess, "Is this your sire?" And she replied, "Yes." And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling the story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "All at once the prince sprang to his feet, seized his sword, and shouted at the king with such a terrible cry that the king became utterly confused. Indeed, the prince would have attacked the king with his sword. But the king realized that the young man was more stalwart than he was, so he sheathed his scimitar and dropped his arms until the prince came up to him. Then the king said, "Young man, are you a human or a genie? If I did not respect your right as my host and cherish your daughter's honor," said the prince, "I'd seal your fate right here and now. How dare you associate me with devils, me, a prince of the royal Khosrows, who, if they wished to take your kingdom, could make you tremble, and you'd feel as if an earthquake had hit you and consumed your realm." Now when the king heard his words, he was overcome with fear and awe, and he replied, "If you are indeed the son of kings, as you claim, how come you've entered my palace without my permission and besmirched my honor by making your way to my daughter and pretending that I've given her to you as your wife? I'll have you know that I've slain kings and sons of kings who sought your hand in marriage. Even now, who could save you from my might and majesty if I were to order my slaves and servants to put you to the vilest of deaths? Who could save you from my power?" When the prince heard the king's speech, he answered, "Truly, I am surprised by you and your lack of sense. Tell me, do you think you could possibly find a husband for your daughter more handsome than I am? Have you ever encountered a man with a stouter heart or one better suited for a sultan or more glorious in rank than I?" "Nay, by Allah," responded the king, "still you should have acted according to the custom of kings and asked me whether you could be her husband before witnesses so that I might have wed her to you in a public ceremony. Yet even now, if I were to marry her to you in private, you've dishonored me in front of her." "All this is true," the prince said, "but if you summon your slaves and soldiers, and they slay me as you claim they can, you would but only make known your own disgrace, and the people wouldn't know whether to believe you or me. Therefore, it seems to me that you do well to listen to my advice." "And what is that?" asked the king. "I propose," the prince declared, "that either you meet me in personal combat, and whoever slays the other shall have complete claim to the kingdom, or else leave me alone this night, and when dawn arrives, call out your cavalry, infantrymen, and servants against me. But first tell me how many there are." "There are 40,000 in the cavalry," said the king, "and just as many in my infantry." "When day breaks," the prince said, "you can set them against me and say to them, 'This man is a suitor for my daughter's hand, and he may only have her if he fights you all alone and wins, for he claims that he can defeat you and put you to rout. After you say this, let me fight them, and if they slay me, your secret and honor will be protected forever. If I overcome them, then a king could have no better son-in-law. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, after hearing this proposal, the king agreed to it, despite the fact that he was awed by the prince's bravery. The king was certain that he would perish in the fray, and therefore he would not have to fear being dishonored. So he called the eunuch and ordered him to go to his vizier right away and tell him to assemble the whole army and prepare for battle. The eunuch carried the king's order to the minister, who immediately summoned the captains of the army and lords of the realm and commanded them to prepare for battle. The king himself sat for a long while conversing with the young prince and was pleased by his wise talk, good sense, and fine breeding. When it was daybreak, the king returned to his throne, commanded his merry men to mount, and ordered them to saddle one of the best of the royal steeds with handsome trappings, and to bring it to the prince. But the young man said, "Your Majesty, I won't mount a horse until I review your troops." "As you wish," replied the king. Then the two went to the parade ground where the troops were assembled, and the prince looked them over and noted their great number. At this point, the king declared to them, "Listen, all you men, this young man has come to ask for my daughter's hand in marriage. Quite truthfully, I've never met a finer lad, nor anyone with a stouter heart or a stronger arm. For he claims that he can overcome you single-handedly and put you to rout. Indeed, he is declared that even if you were 100,000, he would prevail. Now, when he charges at you, I want you to grate him with your sharp pikes and sabers and show him that he's taken on much more than he can handle." Turning now to the prince, the king said, "Get on with it, my son. It's time to do your duty." "Your Majesty," the prince replied, "you are not being fair with me. Am I to go against your men on foot while they are mounted?" The king responded, "I asked you to mount before. Well then, choose any of my horses you like." "None of your horses pleases me," the prince stated. "I'll only ride the horse that I came on." "Well, where's your horse?" the king asked. "On top of the palace," said the prince. "In what part of my palace?" "On the roof." Now, when the king heard these words, he cried, "Stop this nonsense. This is the first sign you've given that you are mad. How can the horse be on the roof? But we'll see at once if you are telling the truth." Then he turned to one of his chief officers and said, "Go to my palace and bring me whatever you find on the roof." All the people gathered at the assembly were astounded by the prince's words, and they began murmuring, "How can a horse come down the steps from the roof? We've never heard of a thing like that before." In the meantime, the king's messenger returned to the palace, climbed the stairs to the roof, and found the horse standing there. Never had it looked more handsome, but when the officer drew near and examined it, he saw that it was made of ebony and ivory. Now the man was accompanied by other officers, who began laughing when they saw that the horse was wooden. Was this the horse that the young man meant? He must be mad. Well, we'll soon see, no matter what. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching, and stopped telling her story when the next night arrived. However, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "Then they lifted the horse and carried it to the king. Once they set it down before him, all his lords flocked around it to marvel at its beauty and the rich saddle and bridle. The king too admired it and was astounded by it. Then he asked the prince, "Young man, is this your horse?" "Yes," he responded, "this is my horse, and you'll soon see how wonderful it is." "Then take it and mount it," commanded the king. "I won't mount it until your troops withdraw a bit," he replied. So the king ordered them to retreat a good bow's shot from the horse, and the prince cried out, "Now watch, my king, for I am about to mount my horse and charge your army and scatter them left and right." Then the prince mounted while the troops arranged themselves in rows before him, and one soldier said to another, "When he comes between the rows, we'll greet him with the points of our pikes and sabers." "By Allah," said another, "this is unfortunate. I find it difficult to slay such a handsome youth." And a third continued, "You'll have to work hard to get the better of him, for I'm sure he's not doing this without knowing his own strength and potential." Meanwhile, after the prince got settled in his saddle, he pushed the button to take off, and all the people strained their eyes to see what he would do. Just then the horse began to heave and rock and sway and make the strangest movements that a steed ever made. Soon its belly was filled with air, and it took off with its rider soaring high into the sky. When the king saw this, he cried out to his men, "Woe to you! Catch him before he escapes." But his viziers and viceroys yelled back, "O king, can a man overtake a flying bird? This man is surely some mighty magician or genie, and may Allah save you from him." After watching the prince's feat, the king returned to the palace, where he went straight to his daughter and told her what had happened on the parade ground. He found her very much distressed because of the prince's departure, and all at once she fell violently sick and took to bed. Now when her father saw her in such a miserable state, He embraced her, kissed her on her forehead, and said, "My daughter, praise the Almighty Allah and thank Him for delivering us from this cunning enchanter, this villain, this thief, who thought only of seducing you." And he repeated to her the story of the prince and how he had disappeared in the sky, and he cursed him, not knowing how dearly his daughter loved him. But she paid no attention to his words and kept on weeping and saying to herself, "By Allah, I'll neither I'll neither eat nor drink until Allah reunites me with him." Consequently, her father became greatly concerned about her condition, and no matter how he tried to soothe her, her longing for the prince only increased. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "Now, when Prince Kamar al-Akmar had risen high in the sky, he turned his horse's head toward his native land, and all he could do was to think about the beauty of the lovely princess. Since he had asked some of the king's people what the name of the city was, he knew that the city was called Sana, and kept its location in mind. Meanwhile, he journeyed as fast as he could to the capital of his own country, and after circling the city, he landed on the roof of his father's palace, where he left his horse. Then he descended into the palace, and upon seeing that the threshold was strewn with ashes, he thought that one of his family had died. As was his custom, he entered the large salon and found his father, mother, and sisters clad in black mourning garments, and all of them were haggard and had pale faces. When his father caught sight of him and was sure that it was his son, he uttered a great cry and fell down in a fit. After a while he came to himself and embraced the prince with great joy. Then they all began to ask him what had happened to him, and he told them everything from first to last. "Praise be Allah for bringing you home safe and sound," the king said, and he ordered his servants to prepare a great festival while the good news spread throughout the city. Drums and cymbals proclaimed the event. The mourning clothes were discarded. The streets and markets were decorated. The people vied with one another as to who should be the first to make the king even more jubilant than he was. In the meantime, the king announced a general amnesty and ordered all the prisoners to be released. Moreover, he had banquets prepared for the people of the city, and for 7 days and 7 nights everyone ate and drank all he wanted, while the king rode around on horseback with his son, so that the people could see the prince and rejoice. After a while the prince asked his father, "What's happened to the man who made the ebony horse?" And the king replied, "I rue the very day that I set eyes on him. He was the cause of your separation from us, my son, and he has been in jail ever since your disappearance. However, now the king ordered the sage to be released from prison, and after sending for him, he presented him with clothes befitting his dignity and treated him generously and kindly, but he would not allow him to wed his daughter. Consequently, the sage became furious and regretted that he had given the king the horse, especially since he knew that the prince had learned the secret of the steed and how to control its movements. Despite the fact that the prince had managed to operate the horse, his father said to him, "You'd do well not to go near the horse from here on, for you don't know all that it can do, and you may make a mistake if you mount it again." Now the prince had told his father about his adventure with the king of Sana and his daughter, and his father remarked that if the king had intended to kill him, he would have done so, but his hour had not yet arrived. In the meantime, the celebration had come to an end, and the king and his son returned to the palace, where they sat down to eat, drink, and make merry. While they were sitting there, one of the king's beautiful slave girls, who was skilled in playing the lute, began to sweep her fingers across the strings and sing a song about the separation of lovers. When the prince heard these verses, the sparks of longing flamed up in his heart, and he yearned for the daughter of the king of Sana. So he rose right away, and after eluding his father's sight, he went up to the roof of the palace, where he mounted the horse and pushed the take-off button, and the horse soared toward the upper regions of the sky. Some time later his father wondered where he was, and after climbing to the roof of the palace, he saw his son high in the firmament, and was greatly troubled and regretted that he had not taken the horse and hidden it. Then he said to himself, "By Allah, if my son returns to me, I'll destroy the horse so that he'll be forced to stay on the ground where he belongs, and I won't have to worry about him anymore." And he began to weep and mourn. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "While the king was weeping, his son kept flying through the sky until he came to the city of Sana and landed on the roof as he had done before. Then he crept downstairs quietly, and finding the eunuch asleep as usual, he raised the curtain and entered the alcove of the prince's chamber. To be on the safe side, he stopped to listen and heard her shedding tears and reciting some verses, while her women slept soundly all around her. Soon, however, some of them woke up because of her weeping and said, "Mistress, why are you mourning for someone who doesn't mourn you?" "You fools," she replied, "do you think he is the kind who forgets or who can be forgotten?" And she began to weep and wail again until sleep overcame her. Upon hearing and seeing all this, the prince's heart melted. So he entered her chamber and saw that she was lying asleep without a cover, and touched her hand, causing her to open her eyes and look at him. "Why all this crying and mourning?" he asked. And when she realized that it was he, she threw herself upon him, gave him a kiss, and said, "Because of you and because we were separated, my lady," he stated, "I too have been desolate because of our separation." "Then why did you leave me?" she asked. "If you had stayed away any longer, I would have died." "But think about my predicament with your father and how he treated me," he answered. "If it had not been for you, love of my life, I would have certainly slain him, but because I love you, I'll love him for your sake." "But you still shouldn't have left me," she said. "Did you really believe that I could continue having a sweet life after meeting you? Let us forget what's happened. That's all past," he declared. "Now I'm hungry and thirsty." So he ordered her maidens to bring in something to eat and drink. Said they began eating, drinking, and conversing until the night was almost over. When they broke, he rose to say goodbye to her before the eunuch would awake. But Shams al-Nahar asked him, "Where are you going?" "To my father's house," he responded, "and I give you my word that I'll come to you once a week." However, she wept and said, "I beg you, by Allah the Almighty, take me with you. I'll go wherever you go. Don't make me suffer the bitter separation again." "Will you really go with me?" he asked. "Yes." "Then," said he, "let's rise and depart." So she got up right away, went to a chest and adorned herself in her richest and dearest trinkets and jewels. Then, without telling her maidens where she was going, she left the chamber with the prince, who took her up to the roof of the palace. After he mounted the Ebony Horse, he lifted her up behind him and tied her to him with some strong rope. When evening was set, he pushed the take-off button, and the horse rose high in the air. When her slave girls saw this, they shrieked aloud and ran and told her father and mother, who rushed to the rooftop only to see the magic horse fly away with the prince and princess. In his anguish, the king cried out, "Prince, I beg of you, by Allah, have mercy on us, and don't take away our daughter." The prince did not reply, but he thought to himself that the lady might regret being separated from her mother and father, and he asked her, "O beauty of the age, do you want me to take you back to your mother and father?" "By Allah, my lord," she said, "my only wish is to be with you. I am so consumed by my love for you that I don't mind being separated from my mother and father." Upon hearing these words, the prince rejoiced and made the horse fly carefully and gently so as not to disquiet her. Indeed, they kept flying until they caught sight of a green meadow with a spring of running water. Here they landed and ate and drank. Then they remounted and flew until they were in sight of his father's capital. The prince was filled with joy at seeing the city and thought that he would show to his beloved his father's dominions, so that she would see that they were greater than those of her sire. So they landed in one of his father's gardens outside the city, and he carried her into a summer house with a doom. He left the ebony horse at the door and told the damsel to keep watch over it while he was away. "Sit here," he said, "until my messenger comes to you. I am going to my father to ask him to prepare lodgings for you, and then I'll show you the royal estate." She was delighted when she heard these words and said, "As you wish." And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "The prince's words indicated to her that he wanted to prepare everything for her so she could enter the city with due honor and respect according to her rank. So she was quite pleased. In the meantime, the prince went to the palace of his father, who rejoiced at his return. Then the prince said to him, "I've brought the king's daughter with me, the lovely damsel I told you about the other day. I've left her outside the city in the summer garden, and I'd like you to prepare a royal procession for her and go out to meet her in majestic array with all your troops and guards." "I'm more than happy to do this," replied the king, and he immediately gave orders to have the town decorated. Then he went and mounted his horse and rode out in all splendor and majesty, leading a host of high officers and servants, followed by a band with drums, kettle drums, fifes, trumpets, and all kinds of instruments. In the meantime, the prince went to his treasury and took out jewelry, rich apparel, and whatever else kings generally keep in a safe place, and he set up a splendid display of his wealth. Moreover, he ordered the servants to prepare a litter with a canopy of green, yellow, and red brocade, and he ordered Indian, Greek, and Abyssinian slave girls to sit inside. Then he left the litter and went to the pavilion where he had set the princess down. Yet neither she nor the horse was there. When he saw this, he slapped his face, tore his garments, and began wandering around the garden as if he had lost his mind. Eventually, however, he came to his senses and asked himself, how could she have discovered the secret of the horse? I didn't tell her anything. Maybe the Persian sage who made the horse happened to come upon her and flew off with her in revenge for the way my father treated him. Then he sought out the guards of the garden and asked them if they had seen anyone enter the grounds. Tell me the truth and the whole truth, or I'll have your heads cut off right away. No one has entered, they said, except for the Persian sage who came to garden to gather some herbs for healing. So the prince was sure that it was indeed the sage who had flown off with the maiden. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "Confused and bewildered, the prince was ashamed when the king and his entourage arrived. Turning to his sire, he told him what had happened and said, 'Take the troops and march back to the city with them. As for me, I'll never return until I cleared up this affair.' When the king heard this, he was distressed and wept. 'My son,' he said, 'calm yourself, try to get over your sorrow, and come home with us. I can arrange a wedding with some other king's daughter.' But the prince paid no attention to his words, and after bidding his father farewell, he set out on a journey while the king returned to the city, and their joy was changed into sadness. Now it was due to destiny that, after the prince had left the princess in the garden house and gone to his father's palace, the Persian entered the garden to gather some special herbs. But when he smelled the sweet aroma of musk and other perfumes that emanated from the princess and impregnated the whole place, he followed his nose until he came to the pavilion where he saw the horse that had made with his own the horse that he had made with his own hands. His heart was filled with joy, for he had bemoaned its loss a great deal since giving it away. So he went up to it, and after examining every part, he found it in perfectly good shape. Just as he was about to mount it and ride away, he said to himself, "Perhaps I should look at what the prince has brought here with the horse before I ride away." So he entered the pavilion, and when he saw the princess sitting there as though she were the sun shining serenely in the sky, he knew at first glance that she was some high-born lady, and was certain that the prince had left her in the pavilion while he had gone to the city to prepare a splendid state procession for her. So he went up to her and kissed the ground before her. Startled, she looked at him and was taken aback by his atrocious appearance and manners. "Who are you?" she asked. "My lady," he answered, "I am a messenger sent by the prince, who has asked me to bring you to another garden nearer the city, because the queen cannot walk this far and does not want to be robbed of the pleasure of welcoming you." "Where's the prince?" "He is in the city with his father," said the Persian, "and he will soon come to meet you in great state." "Tell me, slave," said the princess, "couldn't he have found someone more handsome than you to bring this message to me?" The sage laughed loudly when he heard this and replied, "To tell the truth, he doesn't even have a Mameluke in his service uglier than I am. But don't let my ugly looks deceive you, my lady. He has benefited greatly from my services. Indeed, he chose me as his messenger to you because he is so jealously in love with you, and my loathsome and ugly looks don't threaten him. Otherwise, he has an enormous number of handsome mamelukes, negro slaves, pages, eunuchs, and attendants. When the princess heard this, it made sense, and she believed what the sage had told her, so she got up right away. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling the story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, as the sage took her hand to help her, she asked, what have you brought me to ride on? My lady, he said, you can ride the horse you came on. I can't ride it by myself, she said. Her reply caused him to smile, for he now knew that he was in complete control of her. So he said, I'll ride with you myself. So he mounted and then lifted her behind him and bound her to him as firmly as he could manage. Of course, she did not know what he was going to do with her. Then he pushed the take-off button so that the belly of the horse became full of air, and it swayed back and forth like a wave of the sea. Soon the horse rose and soared into the sky until it was out of sight of the city. Now, when Shams an-Nahar saw this, she asked him, hold on, you, what's going on? I thought the prince sent you to me. May Allah damn the prince, answered the Persian. He is a miserly knave. Woe to you, she cried out, how dare you disobey my lord's orders? He is no lord of mine, replied the sage. Do you know who am I? The only thing I know about you is what you've told me. What I told you wasn't true, said the Persian. It was a trick, for I've lamented the loss of this horse a long time. It was I who constructed it and learned how to master it. And now that I've regained control and have control over you as well, I'll scorch the prince's heart just as he's ravaged mine. I'll never let him have the horse again, never, so don't fret and don't weep, for I can be of more use to you than he was. I'm just as generous as I am wealthy, and my servants and slaves will obey you as their mistress. I'll adorn you in the finest raiment, and your every wish will be fulfilled. When the princess heard this, she slapped her face and cried out, I might as well die. Not only have I lost my mother and father, but I've lost my beloved as well. And she wept bitter tears over what had happened to her, while the sage kept the horse flying through the air until he came to the land of the Greeks and landed in a verdant meadow with streams and trees. Now this meadow was located near a city which was ruled by a powerful king, and it was so happened that he had gone out hunting that day. As he passed by the meadow, he saw the Persian standing there with the damsel and the horse by his side. Before the Persian was aware of what was happening, the king's slaves seized him and took him, the lady and the horse, to their master. Since the sage's atrocious looks were such a striking contrast to the beauty of the girl, he asked, My lady, what is your relationship to this old man? The Persian tried to interfere with a quick reply. My lord, she is my wife and the daughter of my father's brother. But the lady was quick to reveal his lie. By Allah, I don't know this man, and he's certainly not my husband. No, he's a wicked magician who's abducted me by force and fraud. On hearing these words, the king ordered his servants to give the Persian a beating, and they thrashed him until he was almost dead. Then the king commanded them to carry him to the city and throw him into jail. On the other hand, he kept the damsel with him and put her in the seraglio while the horse was stored in his treasury, even though he did not know its secret and how valuable it was. In the meantime, Prince Kamar al-Akmar journeyed from city to city and country to country, asking the people who he encountered whether they had seen the princess and the magic horse. Of course, everyone was amazed by his talk and thought he was somewhat touched in the head. Though he continued doing this for a long time, he did not obtain any news of her. At last he came to her native city of Sana, but nobody had any idea where she was, and her father was still mourning her loss. Therefore, he turned back and headed for the land of the Greeks, and continued to make inquiries along the way. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching, and stopped telling the story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, as chance would have it, the prince stopped at a particular khan and saw a group of merchants sitting and talking. So he sat down near them and heard one of them say, my friends, let me tell you about this marvelous thing that I recently witnessed. What was it? They asked. I was visiting a district in the nearby city, and I heard the people talking about an event that had happened not too long ago. It so happened that the king went out hunting one day with his courtiers, and they came to a meadow where they found an old man with a woman and a wooden horse made out of ebony. The man was atrocious, but the woman was amazingly beautiful, elegant, and graceful. As for the wooden horse, it was miraculous. No one had ever seen anything as perfectly made as this horse was. And what did the king do with them? They asked. Well, said the merchant, the king questioned the man who claimed to be the woman's husband, but she denied this right away and declared that he was a sorcerer and a villain. So the king took her from him and had him beaten and thrown into jail. As for the ebony horse, I don't know what happened to it. When the prince heard the merchant's story, he drew closer to him and began questioning the merchant discreetly and asked him about the names of the king and the city. Once the prince found out all he wanted to know, he spent the night full of joy. As soon as it was dawn, he set forth until he reached the city. But just as he was about to enter it, the gatekeepers stopped him and intended to bring him before the king, so his majesty could question him about the craft he practiced and the reason why he had come to the city. Such was the custom of their ruler. However, it was supper time when he entered the city, and it was impossible to see the king or to ask for instructions as to what to do with the stranger. So the guards took him to jail, thinking that it would be best if he spent the night there. But when the wardens saw how handsome and dignified he was, they could not find it in their hearts to imprison him. Instead, they made him sit with them outside the walls, and when their food was brought to them, they allowed him to share their meal. As soon as they had finished eating, they turned to the prince and said, "What country do you come from?" "I come from Persia," he answered, "the land of the Chosroes." When they heard this, they laughed, and one of them said, "Of Chosroes, I've heard men tell stories and have checked to see how much truth there was in them, but never have I seen or heard a bigger liar than the Chosroan who's in our jail right now. And never have I seen a face and figure as hideous as his," said another guard. "What has he been lying about?" asked the prince. "He claims that he is a sage," one of the guards said. "The king found him one day when he was out hunting. The old man had a beautiful woman and a remarkable ebony horse with him. As for the damsel, she is with the king, who has fallen in love with her and wants to marry her. But she is mad, and if the old man were really so wise, he could heal her, but he can't, and the king has been doing his utmost to discover a cure for her disease. He spent an enormous amount of money this past year for physicians and astrologers on her account, but nobody has found a way to cure her. As for the horse, it's in the royal treasury, and the ugly man is with us in prison. Every night, as soon as it gets dark, he begins to weep and won't let us sleep." And Scheherazade noticed that the dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "After listening to what the guards had to say about the Persian prisoner, the prince thought of a way to free the princess. In the meantime, the guards became tired, and since they wanted to sleep, they took the prince inside the jail and locked the door. Once there, the prince overheard the wails and moans of the Persian sage, who said in his own language, 'Alas, how I repent my sins, for I've sinned against myself and the king's son. I should never have abducted the damsel. I haven't gained a single thing from it. Truly, I should know by now not to reach for things that are above my station in life.' Now when the prince heard this, he approached the Persian and said, 'How long will this weeping and wailing last? Tell me, do you think that what's happened to you has never happened to anyone else?' Since the Persian did not recognize the prince, he made friends with him and began to tell him all about his misfortunes. And as soon as morning arrived, the guards took the prince to their king and informed him that he had entered the city on the previous night at a time when an audience was impossible. "Where do you come from?" the king asked the prince. "What is your name and trade, and why have you traveled here?" "As to my name," the prince answered, "I'm called Hajar in Persian, and I come from Persia. As to my profession, I practice the art of medicine and heal the sick and those whom the jinn drive mad. In order to learn all there is to know, I travel from country to country and try to learn more by healing new patients." Now when the king heard this, he was extremely glad and said, "O excellent sage, you've come just at the right time." Then he told him about the princess and added, "If you cure her and she recovers from her madness, you may have anything you want from me." "May Allah give his blessings to the king," said the prince. "Describe to me all the symptoms of your insanity, and tell me how long it's been since she had this malady. You must also recount how you found her, the horse and the sage." So the king told him the whole story from first to last, and he added, "Right now the sage is in jail." "And what have you done with the horse?" asked the prince. "I still have it," he said. "I've put it in my treasury." Hearing this, the prince said to himself, "I'd better see the horse first and make sure that it's in good condition. If it is, all will be well, and all will end well. But if its motor has been destroyed, I must find some other way of rescuing my beloved." So he turned to the king and said, "I must see the horse in question, for I may need it to help the damsel recover from her madness." "With all my heart," said the king, and he took him by the hand and led him to the place where the horse was being kept. The prince went around it, examining its condition, and found it in perfect condition. Therefore he was full of joy and said to the king, "May Allah bless you. Now I would like to go and examine the damsel to see what her condition is like, for I hope to heal her through the means of this horse." Then he ordered them to take good care of the horse, and the king led him to the prince's chamber. While the king remained outside, the prince went in and found her wringing her hands, writhing, beating herself against the ground, and tearing her garments to tatters. But there was really no madness of the jinn in her, and she did this only to keep people away from her. When the prince saw her acting like this, he said, "Nobody's going to harm you, my beauty." And he went on to soothe her and speak sweetly to her until he could whisper, "I'm Kamar al-Akmar," whereupon she uttered a loud cry and fainted out of joy. The king thought this was epilepsy brought on by her fear of him. Then the prince put his mouth to her ear and said, "Oh, Shams al-Nahar, be careful, for our lives are at stake. Be patient and on your guard. We must plan everything carefully to escape from this tyrannical king. My first move will be now to go out to him and tell him that you are possessed by a genie and hence your madness. Nevertheless, I'll tell him that I can heal you and drive the evil spirit away. But he must untie your bonds right away. Then when he enters here, speak nicely to him, to that he'll think that I've cured you. Then we'll be able to do whatever we want. Don't worry, she whispered. I'll do just as you say. So the prince went out to the king in a joyful mood and said, Majesty, I've been fortunate to locate the root of her disease, and I've also managed to cure her for you. In fact, you may now go in to see her, but speak to her gently and treat her kindly. Make sure you promise her whatever she wants, and you will receive your just rewards. And Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her story. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, So the king entered the chamber, and when she saw him, she rose and kissed the ground before him. Then she welcomed him by saying, I'm grateful that you've come to visit your servant today. The king was ecstatic and ordered their waiting women and eunuchs to attend her and take her to the hammam and get various rich garments ready for her. So they too entered the chamber and saluted her, and she returned their salams with the most polite language and pleasant comportment. Thereupon they clad her in a royal apparel, and after putting a necklace of jewels around her neck, they took her to the bath and attended to her every need there. Then they brought her out, glistening like the radiant moon itself, and when she came into the king's presence, she saluted him and kissed the ground before him, whereupon he rejoiced and said to the prince, Doctor, all this is due to your great gifts. May Allah enable us to profit even more from your healing spirit. My king, the prince replied, in order to complete the cure, it is necessary for you and your troops to return to the place where you found her, and you must bring the black wooden horse with her, for there is a devil in it, and unless I exorcise the satanic creature, he'll torment her at the beginning of every month. I'm only too happy to comply with your advice, said the king, for you are the prince of all philosophers and the most learned of all who see the light of day. Then the king ordered the ebony horse to be brought to the meadow and rode there with all his troops and the princess, for nor did he have the slightest inkling about the prince's plans. Now when they came to the appointed place, the prince, still dressed as a physician, ordered them to set the princess and the steed together and as far away from the king and his troops as possible. Once this was done, he turned to the king and said, With your permission, I'll now proceed to fumigate the enemy of mankind, so that he'll never return to her again. After this, I'll mount this wooden horse, which seems to be made of ebony, and set the damsel behind me. The horse will shake and sway back and will eventually head directly for you. At this point, the affair will be at an end, and you'll be able to do with the damsel whatever you like." When the king heard these words, he was ecstatic. So the prince left him and went to the horse. After mounting it and lifting the princess behind him, he tied her to him tightly while the king and his troops observed. Then he pushed the take-off button, and the horse sprang into the air and soared with them on high until they disappeared from sight. After this, the king stayed put for half the day, expecting from them to return, but they did not reappear. Eventually, he gave up hope and regretted everything he had done and grieved over the loss of the damsel. Since there was nothing he could do, he went back to the city with his troops and sent for the Persian, who was in the prison, and said to him, "You traitor, you villain, why did you hide the secret of the Ebony Horse from me? Now a swindler has come and stolen it from me along with your lady, whose ornaments are worth a mint, and I'll never see anything of them again." So the Persian related to the king everything that had happened to him in the past, from the first to the last, and the king became so terribly furious that he almost died. He locked himself up in his palace for a while and kept mourning until his viziers came to him and comforted him. "Your Majesty," they said, "truly the man who took the damsel is an enchanter, and praise be to Allah, for he has rescued you from his sorcery." And they did not stop talking to him in this way until he became reconciled to the fact that he had lost the princess forever. In the meantime, the prince continued flying toward his father's capital in great joy until he landed on the terrace of the palace. After setting down the princess in safety, he went to his father and mother, saluted them, and told them that he had brought the princess back to the palace. Of course, they were extremely happy, and great banquets were prepared for the people of the city, and Scheherazade noticed that dawn was approaching and stopped telling her tale. When the next night arrived, however, she received the king's permission to continue her tale and said, "The celebration of the prince's return lasted an entire month, and at the end of this time he married the princess, and they enjoyed each other with great delight on the wedding night. However, the king broke the ebony horse in pieces and destroyed the mechanism that enabled it to fly. Moreover, the prince wrote a letter to the prince's father telling him about everything that had happened to his daughter and informing him that she was now married to him and was safe and happy. This letter was sent by a messenger who carried valuable presents and rare articles for the king. When he arrived at the city of Sana and delivered the letter and presents, the king rejoiced and bestowed honors on the messenger, and in addition, he sent rich gifts to his son-in-law via the same messenger, who returned to his master and reported everything that had happened. And the prince was glad. After this, he wrote a letter every year to his father-in-law and sent him presents until, in the course of time, his own father, King Sabu, died and he succeeded him to the throne. The new king Akmar was a just ruler, and he treated his lieges fairly and wisely, so that his subjects became exceedingly loyal to him. Indeed, Kamar al-Akmar and his wife Shams al-Nahar led a life of joy and solace until they were finally visited by the destroyer of delights and the sunderer of societies. No sooner had Scheherazade concluded her tale than she said, "And yet, O king, the story is no more wondrous than the tale of Ali Baba and the 40 thieves."